welcome to the final part of the Artivism Fellowship. My name is Joshua Slack. I am one of the Artivism Fellows, and I've been a fellow of this cohort since June of last year, and it's actually, it's a bit bittersweet to be at this part of the entire program because now we're coming to the official end. Even though this previous weekend we were able to have our final reflections and everything, today is the day that I have to say, not necessarily goodbye, but just kind of, well, this is the end of the chapter as far as my contribution within the program. So myself as an Artivism Fellow, as well as just an artist and activist, I am an actor, a photographer, a writer, and a director with a special interest for social justice, whether that is something like racialized justice or communal justice or anything of that sort, as well as just expressing myself in art. I love movies, I love plays, I love doing things within that realm of just expression, but also using my art as a tool to just be radical in a sense, and just be able to reach out to communities as well as express myself and whatever it is that I am feeling within the community. And I'm very appreciative of the Artivism, just the team, the cohort, the fellowship, for really helping me hone in more on that aspect of my life that was able to, that I was able to really become a better artist, a better activist, a better artivist, and I'm incredibly thankful for just the opportunity right now to go ahead and just have this introduction. So about Artivism, it was coordinated by the AFSC Pan Valley Institute. The Artivism Fellowship Program seeks to empower and foster civic engagement through creative artistic expression and collective leadership amongst the Central Valley's youth of color. The fellowship program provides supported spaces and opportunities for youth of color to transform their environment through political engagement. So that was just a brief introduction as far as what Artivism is and exactly what this entire event really is kind of culminating with a very special presentation. So thank you for having me, thank you for having our guest speaker, and just thank you. And Cecilia will be up next.
Hello everyone, my name is Cecilia Moreno. I was a past fellow, not this year, but the previous year. I had worked with Pan Valley. A little bit about myself. Hey, Cecilia. Hi, I just want to introduce myself in my native language. I am Tashi Wakchemni. So I'm from the Yoka tribes in the area, and just to introduce that, you know, we're on native land, and I appreciate Pan Valley letting me introduce Dr. Ybarra today. So we're having her speak today, and she has her doctorate in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. She has done her post-doctoral work at Harvard, where she was also a scholar in residence. After 45 years in higher education, she has recently retired from Johns Hopkins University. She was taught and was executive director of the Central Talented Youth. The center had about 100 students in 120 countries and established programs throughout the world. Dr. Ybarra had received many awards for her teaching and community service, and is the author of several books, including Americanos, Latino for Latino United States, co-edited with Edward James Olmos. And thank you so much for allowing me to introduce her for today, and I hope everyone have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I guess I begin now. Thank you both very much for the explanation of activism and the introduction as well. I appreciate it. I want to thank Mirna Martinez and the Pan Valley Institute and American Friends Service Committee for having me here. It makes me realize how old I am, though, that I'm part of the history of the Chicano Movement that happened before some people were born. But anyway, another challenge is that I was mentioned, I've been a professor for over 45 years at Fresno State and at Johns Hopkins University, and a scholar in residence at Harvard. And so we're taught as professors to talk about one topic for an entire semester. So now I have to talk about several topics. The Cesar Chavez, the United Farmworkers Movement, the Vietnam War, civil rights movement, the role of women, and I was also asked to talk about my own experiences with the Chicano movement. So obviously I'll only be able to touch on a few things. I have a few video excerpts that I want to show you as well. And hopefully this will allow you to then think about, oh, this would be something interesting that you could follow up on or get more research on. Because again, we won't be able to go through everything in detail tonight. But at least I want to whet your appetite for lifelong learning. I remember I had students who I would tell them, oh, you know what, I'm going to go to an institute this summer. And they go, my goodness, Dr. Ybarra, you already have your doctorate. You don't have to go back to school. And I said, yeah, but I want to go back. I want to learn. And I have this card that's always been on my desk that's a little perplexed bear leaning up against a tree. And he says, there's been an increasing number of things I know nothing about. And that's exactly how how I feel. Every day there's something new that we can find out about and we can learn about. And that's what makes, I think, life more exciting, when we're open to learning about new things. So let me begin in terms of the Chicano movement in general. Before I talk about what happened in the 60s, though, I want to mention that there's always been a struggle for our rights in this country. Back in the 1800s, when you had people like Tiburcio Vázquez and Joaquin Murrieta that American society considered bandits, we considered them heroes because they fought for the rights of Mexicanos in this country. And also what people may not, I think most people are familiar with the fact that a lot of, unfortunately, African Americans were lynched in the South, but they don't know that literally hundreds and hundreds of Mexicans and Native Americans were lynched in the West and Southwest. And there's photographs of that of historians that have shown those kind of lynchings that occurred and the segregation that was extreme for us in this part of the area. And so again, you had people like these that always fought for the rights of Mexicanos. And then you also had struggles in the fields. Even though we're most familiar now with Cesar Chavez and the struggle of the 60s, the struggles in the fields for better wages and decent living conditions started back in the 1930s. Because again, as most people know, if you know California, you know with all the Spanish names that Mexicanos and other Latinos have been here for many, many years, and it's not a new phenomena. And then also struggles in education have occurred. They're still going on now, but again, one of the first major cases was in 1947 in Mendez versus Westminster, where he sued the Orange County School District in California for doing what school districts across the West were doing, and that is putting students, Mexican-American students, in remedial schools. Anybody that didn't speak Spanish, or English, was considered remedial, and they put them in these schools, and it was really just a way of segregating Mexican students from white students. And his daughter was born here, she spoke perfect English, and he said, why is my daughter in a remedial school? So when it went to the Supreme Court, and when he won that case, it literally desegregated a lot of schools in the West. Just as we know about Brown versus Education, it desegregated a lot of schools throughout the country. So again, those struggles have always occurred. And then there was also the issue of, but again, these struggles in the Chicano movement did not occur in a vacuum. There was all kinds of things that occurred because even before the Chicano movement and the discrimination that was faced then by soldiers, you also had discrimination faced by Mexican-American soldiers who came back from World War II. There was also cases that included, in Texas and in California and so forth, because Mexican-Americans who were killed in World War II were not allowed to be buried in some of their home cemeteries because the cemeteries were segregated. You can believe the extremes of racism to that point. So they had to fight to have Mexican-Americans buried in their home cemeteries to be able to do that. And then also, to add insult to injury, Mexican-Americans who were in uniform were not served in restaurants. And there were signs in many places that said no dogs or Mexicans allowed, which meant that meant we were even lower than dogs in the eyes of many of the people in this area. So that was the history of it. And there's always been struggle, there's always been fights for people for us to get our rights by many people across the generations. But the big movement started in the 60s, the Chicano Movement, where not just students or not just farm workers or not just, other individuals, war veterans, were facing their individual struggles. Everybody got together in some of those protests to ensure that we had things in education, in the military, and all kinds of areas as well. And that was the foundation that led to the Chicano movement going forward. And one of the things, too, that occurred was that for those of us fortunate enough to be out of the 60s, even though we age ourselves, it was really a time of a lot of change going on. There was a civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and the bus boycotts and the strikes and all the things that were going on there. There was Asians fighting for their rights, women's rights were fighting, SDS, Students for Democratic Society, white students were fighting to have their rights. And you, of course, then had the Chicanos in the West and the Puerto Ricans in the East, Latinos, who were fighting for their rights as well to have a better society. So all this was happening at the same time. And as a part of, so you had the Chicano movement, part of the civil rights movement, there was also the Vietnam War going on. That also started in 54, 55, and then did not until the 70s, with the major battles being fought in the 1960s, like the Tet Offensive in 1968. So there was no separation there. If you were in the Chicano movement, you were against the war. It was as simple as that, because of the fact that there were a lot of Mexicanos. Back then you had to get a deferment, and you could only get a deferment if you went to college. Well, if you were a Mexicano during that time, where were the deferments? Most of our people were not in the universities and colleges, so they could not get the deferment. So it actually became a battle of a war with the poor blacks, the poor whites, the poor Mexicanos fighting that war. And as one person said, Rosalio Munoz, he wrote a manifesto called the Cinco de Mayo Manifesto, where he said, we are the cannon fodder for this war. And it's interesting because I heard the same with obviously the war going on in Ukraine right now, where you see the devastation that's going on. One of the individuals said, we're the cannon fodder for this war. And again, those are the kinds of things that occurred. And I have, one of the things that sort of started the whole process there of Chicanos realizing that this was a war that was wrong, in addition, was they were saying, we are people of color fighting people of color. And the other thing, too, was that Dr. Ralph Guzman out of UC Santa Cruz wrote an article where he showed that although at that point Latinos were only 9% of the population, we were over 25% of the casualties. And so he said something is going on, that they're feeding us into the war machine. And I have a little clip, and it's a clip of a film called Vietnam Veterano. It's narrated by Sylvia Astorga, and the song is by Al Reyes, who was a newscaster in this area for many years before he moved to Los Angeles. And I think we have it set up, if we can show that, that clip.
And not cared for.
Well, this, I can give you some statistics too while this, is it gonna take a minute or so? Can you show the clip now? Okay, while they're setting it up, if it starts, I'll just stop talking. But I wrote a book called Vietnam Veteranos, and the reason I wrote the book was because I had 14 cousins and my brother that served in Vietnam, all at the same time. And they were in every branch of the service. My brother was a Marine, you had my cousins in the Navy, in the Army, and in the Air Force. And one of the things that I thought was, I was looking at the movies that were coming out and the books that were coming out, is nothing talked about the experiences of Latinos and Mexicanos in Vietnam and the sacrifices that they made. And I didn't want to write about it to glorify the war and say, oh, look at what great heroes we were, because they were, but to say we were part of that story too and part of that history, and we were left out again, as we often are in the history of this country. And the devastation in Vietnam was tremendous. just to give you a few statistics on it. And again, we look at, unfortunately, we do not learn from history, and the same devastation is occurring in Ukraine. But for Americans, over 57,000 Americans were killed, and over 300,000 were wounded. And we also know by now that the suicide rate among Vietnams, more have been killed by suicide than were actually killed in the war itself. So there's a tremendous issue with mental health among our veterans. $24 billion was spent on the Vietnam, and 1.2 million tons of bombs were dropped on Vietnam. So what did it do for the Vietnamese people? Over 120,000 Vietnamese military were killed, and 500,000 were wounded. 444,000 South Vietnamese
Get your 16 ready, it's time to go. You crawl through jungles, steamy hot. You saw battles, your age get shot. Heard the cries, saw them die there. You come home with ugly nightmare. Que loco, Vietnam, veterano. González, Torres y Lascano. On the front lines again, los Chicanos. Martinez, Garcia y Lujano.
The rationale for the Vietnam War was the defense of the South from the invading Viet Cong. Recruits left expecting to contain a belligerent group of communists they expected to win. But they arrived in Vietnam ignorant of both the conditions and the enemy. They found villagers who behaved like spectators to the war. They were surprised by the heat of the dry season that drained them of both strength and patience. The monsoon rains were equally relentless, causing many soldiers to withdraw into long periods of depression.
I remember my first mission. I actually sat on my steel pot because I saw some bugs I'd never seen before in my life, and I was really scared. Then after a while, after getting shot at a couple of times, that was removed real quick.
This is interesting, huh? They always told us, you got to kill them because you don't know who your enemy is. But in reality, man, they were all our enemy, just because we were their enemy. We were fighting one people, one country, it wasn't the U.S. and the Southern Vietnamese against the Northern Vietnamese. And those were the realizations that brought me to really turning anti-war.
It was mounting opposition to the Vietnam War from both the civilian population and military personnel, lack of specific military strategies except for increasing the Viet Cong casualties, and the bloody atrocities that left soldiers with little or no sense of direction. And for many, the anxieties were compounded. They felt discrimination on the battlefield. They were made to feel like frontline guinea pigs.
It was compounded in the sense that it showed me that one of the reasons that I had gone into the military was to somehow fit into society like other Mexicanos had in previous wars. And because I thought it would be somewhat of an economic stabilizer.
We have always, I guess you could say, been, I don't want to say subservient for being such a harsh word, but something to that effect. We've always been made to feel that as second-class citizens. And I think I was, really put out and upset with the fact that, okay, we can be second-class citizens here and get the second-class job, so to speak, and yet when it came time to do some dirty work like Vietnam, we were Johnny on the spot, and it's where they wanted us, and we were good enough for that. We were good enough to go over there and put our butts on the line.
We were perfect fodder for the guns. for the war machine. They could afford to lose us. We weren't producing. We would never produce the way society was going. We didn't have technical skills. We didn't have the advanced education to go into technological society. So we were good for the war machine. And that's exactly how they treated us.
One of the hard things about Vietnam is you have a tendency to get really tight and close with brothers, you know, with the guys. And, you know, they could be here today and gone tomorrow. And we lost a lot of guys. I mean, I don't care what anybody says, we got our butts kicked.
In July, you were fighting away with a raza on the street in LA. They said this country ships us off to fight, to return and deny us our right. So Chicanos fought and Chicanos died. Spirits of Aztec warriors at their side. Fight fiercely, what else could we do? Just like we did in World War II. Que loco, Vietnam veterano, Jose Luis y Chano, on the front line again, los Chicanos, Martinez, Garcia y Lujano.
Americans have always been good at homecoming ceremonies and wars past.
Devastating war, and a lot of families, millions of families, were affected by it in this country. And the country was divided between those who were supporting the war and those who were against the war. And just the way we see Black Lives Matter marches now, where everybody is together, that's the way the marches against the Vietnam War was. You had young people, old people, you had students, you had all kinds of professions there. And you had a lot of military that were coming back from the war that realized that they, as the person said, were used and abused. And so it was really a difficult situation. And the other thing too was that war, you know, nowadays you're seeing a devastation in Ukraine, but in terms of American wars like Afghanistan and Iraq, you didn't really see the daily devastation. Here, we do see it in Vietnam. I remember it was on the TV every single night. All the bombings, we knew where my brother was located. We knew the day that, I know my mother cried for 3 days straight one time because he was on a mountain, the Marines were on a mountain, that 600 Marines were killed that day. And she just, until we heard from her, and you would get word through the Red Cross to see if your loved one was still alive. So it took 2, 3, 4 days for the chaos to end, to find out if the person was alive or not. And a lot of families were going through that kind of thing. And I had a cousin who was a medic. He was he was against the war, but he wanted to still serve in terms of a medic role, but not using a gun. So he got killed in Vietnam. And we didn't want to tell my brother, but he said that every day there's a list that's published by the military paper out there. So he said he saw the name Jose Angel Lopez, and he goes, it can't be him. Then he saw Sanger, because we're from Sanger, and he goes, it can't be him. He said even when he saw the full name and the town, he couldn't believe that our cousin had been killed. Don't forget, kids that were going out there, they were kids. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. And so again, that devastation was there forever. So when you look at the Chicano movement, that's why Chicanos, part of that was against the war, because we saw the devastation, we saw the casualties in our community, and we saw what was going on. And as I mentioned, the statistic that I showed you, just billions of dollars were spent, but more than anything, so many hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. And so many pieces of their country was devastated with all the bombs and so forth. So again, when you were against, as I mentioned before, when you were against in the Chicano Movement, when you were wanting to fight for justice and equality and so forth, fighting against the Vietnam War and wanting to bring the troops home was part of that fight. And then, so now I'd like to go in a little bit into, because tomorrow is Cesar Chavez Day of Service, March 31st. And one of the things that really made a big difference in our lives as students was the United Farmworkers. Because at that point, there was just a handful of us in colleges and universities. But it was the biggest cohort of us that had gone in there. So in sense, you had Chicanos in universities throughout the Southwest, in other parts of the country. And it was the first time that you had a significant number of us, more than just a handful. And when they asked me to talk about a little bit about experiences, I remember that I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley at the time. So I would come down for the summers and work trying to end the strikes, because they had strikes and picket lines in the fields. And we're trying to organize the farm workers, so they would have just an election, just a simple election was what we were trying to do, which was their right to have, and legally, and yet we had guns pointed to our heads. I remember having this, and we had dogs sicked on us. I remember one time we're on this one ranch, and the owner just sicked these 2 huge Dobermans on us. And the wife was the one that called them off, rather than what would have happened. And we also, was a time where hundreds of us were arrested, over 1,000 really, they were arrested because we were picketing on the picket lines. And there's a film that I want to show a clip of, it's called Fighting for Our Lives, that I hope we can just show a tiny bit of it, but it really goes through a lot of the history of the farm workers. It's both in English and in Spanish, and it shows the violence against farm workers for their rights. And there's one part where every time there was you wanted to go pick at a farm, there was an injunction. There was like hundreds of court injunctions, right? Because at that point, they supported the farmers and not the farm workers. The courts did. And so there was a point where there was one injunction where the legal assistant is saying they want us 60 feet from that side of the street and 60 feet from this side of the street, which puts us somewhere up in the air. So in essence, they wanted to just not have farm workers participate in those kinds of things. And so they picked us up, and they were in jail. They bused us, put us in buses, and took us to jail. Over 600 women were arrested that day, and over 1,000 men. And they put the men at the city jail, Fresno City Jail, the women at the Fresno County Jail. And then there was a lot of strikes and so forth that were going on in other parts as well. And so my brother was at the city jail, I was at the Fresno County Jail, and my sister, who was a student at San Francisco State at the time, was on a hunger strike because students at universities were having hunger strikes because so many people were arrested. So my parents went from my brother in the jail, city jail, to me in the Fresno County Jail, to my sister on the hunger strike in San Francisco, just to make sure that we were okay. But like so many at that time, they really believed in what we were doing. And my parents never complained about it. They were always very proud that we stood up for our rights. Even though we were no longer farm workers and hadn't been for a long time, we remembered our roots. And that's what I think is critical, is that people, whether you were working in the fields or not, need to remember that our community is still there. It's like Maya Angelou said, that it's not, or in fact, and I tell my students too, that there's no shame in being comfortable, because our parents worked hard for us to get nice homes and nice cars. The shame comes in forgetting that others are not as comfortable. And so I think that was what was instilled in us through Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement, that we all have a part to play in the struggle of people who are facing injustice. And it didn't come easy. I mean, I remember when I was in college, I started my freshman year at Fresno State, and we were what we were called at that time tapados, like a kettle that's got a tapa to it, a lid, because we really didn't know what was going on. I remember thinking, well, gee, why do the farm workers want rights when they don't have an education? You have to have an education to get better wages. Well, then it so happened that Cesar Chavez was starting his march in 1966, and one of the stops was at Fresno State. And when he stopped there, you saw, I mean, the Chicano students, we went out there to support him and to listen to the speech and so forth. But then at that point, you had the ag students that were there, and they brought in boxes of grapes because there was the grape boycott going on. They brought in boxes of grapes and were eating the grapes in front of Cesar and throwing grapes, you know, at the farm workers. And it got us so upset, and you finally realized, no, you know what? It doesn't make any difference whether you have an education or not. Every worker deserves dignity, and every worker deserves decent wages and so forth. And so I think that that made a lot of us as students realize that that was part of our struggle too, that as Mexicanos, we had to be part of that struggle. And so, and I think Cesar realized how many students now were being involved in recognizing what was going on. And so he called a big conference in Coachella just for university students, and several thousand of us showed up. And he told us, you know, how we needed to help to be in the fields, and also to, when they were trying to boycott the grapes and the lettuce, and we were, you know, back in our schools during the year, in Berkeley's and wherever, LA's and so forth, to boycott the stores and to be out there and picket the stores so that people would then not buy the lettuce and the grapes that were not there. And I remember being there in 1970 when my brother was always involved with the United Farmworkers and became one of the vice presidents. And I remember that he called me and he said, you know, we're signing our first contracts. So you had 19 growers sitting there all signing the first contracts in agricultural labor. That was a momentous time because you finally realized that farm workers were getting their right to at least have decent wages and decent water and so forth. And I tell my students now, you know, child labor has been outlawed in this country for many years. But I never remember any inspector coming in when I was working in the fields at 7, 8, 9 years old and saying, oh, gee, children shouldn't be out here. Our parents took us because where else were they going to put us? There was no childcare at the time or anything else. Everybody else was working. All our neighbors were working in the fields during that time as well. And so the UFW contracts allows that to happen, to have protections against children working in the fields, to have water, to have a bathroom. I mean, heaven forbid that people have those kinds of decent things. And I think the union started by Cesar Chavez and of course Dolores Huerta and Gilbert Padilla made that difference in people's lives. And it has continued, the struggle continues today because again, when they don't have contracts, those rights go away. And people then have to fight again for the things. So it's almost like you take one step forward, 2 steps back, but you have to keep going forward regardless of the circumstances. And so one of the things that I think Cesar Chavez taught us was that we had, as I mentioned, a responsibility beyond ourselves. And it went really beyond politics. It made me realize, and the other students, that it was an issue of basic human rights. And he brought us unity, and I think that time that he came on campus and we saw how he was mistreated and the farm workers were mistreated, it really made us realize that, you know what, nobody, as I mentioned, deserves that kind of treatment. I remember one time being at a store here in Fresno, and there was a farm worker that was standing. There was like a line of 2 women, and there was the farm worker, and it was myself. And then I saw that the man had a carton of milk and a loaf of bread, Mexicano, and he was dirty because he was just coming from the field, right? And I remember thinking, and it was a very hot day, and I remember thinking, oh my God, thank God I'm no longer working in those fields, and I felt sorry for him. But I saw the women in front going, like talking about him and moving away from him, like if there was something terribly wrong with him. And I remember thinking, how sad that this man who's picking the fruit that's gonna go on their table, and they're treating him like he's less than human, as opposed to because I knew the experience, I was thinking, poor man, he's really had a hard day, and he's just picking up milk and bread for his family. And so I think that's the kind of thing that we need to realize, that the Cesar Chavez movement and what Cesar Chavez did was not just for farm workers. He enlightened and made all of us, I think, realize that we had a difference. So out of that, the United Farmworkers movement came the issues of EOP and upward bound in colleges and universities, ethnic studies in universities, where we say we want professors that look like us to be teaching us as well, and we want part of our history to be there. And we don't want to be invisible anymore in this society, because we've contributed a lot to this society in every single way for generations. And so one of the things that Chavez said, I think is really important. He said, "We cannot seek achievement for ourselves and forget about progress and prosperity for our community. Our ambitions must be broad enough to include the aspirations and needs of others for their sakes and for our own." Excuse me, I get allergies here in Fresno. And I think that speaks to me so much in terms of what we have to do, and that we can't forget, and we can't rest, and we can't lay back and say, somebody else's job, not mine. And I think as long as we have people who look at this gentleman that was a farm worker, hardworking farm worker, and look at him as less than equal, then we've got work to do. And so so when you talk about how does the struggle continue, the struggle does continue, because we have to deal with the issues of education. We still have too many dropouts in our communities. Although there's been, even though I'm going to talk about the issues, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact of all the progress that's made too. When I was in Fresno growing up, I never saw a Mexican doctor, ever. It was mostly Anglo doctors. Now, my doctor's Mexican, Dr. Gonzalez. My daughter's pediatrician grandchildren's pediatrician is Mexican, Dr. Chapa, a woman. My daughter's doctor is another medical doctor that's a woman. My mom's doctor is Dr. Batista, Mexicano. So we have made progress in those things. You go into universities now where there used to be 1 or 2 professors when I started teaching 50 years ago. Now we have more, not as many as we should, but we have 20, 30, 40 professors in a university now. When we were at Berkeley, there was just so few of us. And I remember one time being in an elevator at Berkeley, and there was myself, and then a woman came in, Mexicana or Latina, with I knew she was with the post office because she had the bag, right? And then some other guy walked in, and we were just the 3 of us in the elevator, and I said, "I'll bet this is the biggest gathering of Chicanos that Berkeley has ever seen," because there was just that few of us there. And now half the entering class of Berkeley this coming year is Latino. Isn't that amazing? And I know Fresno State's already at half, when before I think there was when I started there, I think there was 55 of us, because you can count the Spanish surnames. So there's progress that has been made, and we can't deny that, and we need to be proud of that progress. But then again, we can't forget that we still have issues to deal with in education and all these other areas as well. And one of the things that I want to touch on before I get too much into that is the role of women, because I think that we also have Chicano women. I use Chicana because that's my era. I know now there's, some people use Hispanic, some people use Latino, some people use Latinx, but when I refer to Chicanos, that's my era. And it's interesting that the majority, or I'll say I'm Mexicana. When people say, "What are you?" I say I'm Mexican or I'm Mexicana. And I like to say I'm Mexican. Even though I was born here and my parents were born here and their parents were born here, we come from the area of Texas that was once Mexico but isn't longer there. But so we've been in this quote country for many generations. But I still like to say that I'm Mexican because I know some people don't think that's a good word, or they think, "Oh, you should be ashamed of me." No, we should be proud of being Mexican. I remember one time this person told me, she asked me, "What are you?" I said, "I'm Mexican." And she says, "Oh, you shouldn't say that. Why don't you say you're Spanish?" I said, "Because I'm not Spanish, I'm Mexican." I said, "Even though Mexicans are Spanish and indigenous, right? But we're Mexican." And she says, "Oh, but," I said, "Why should I say I'm Spanish when I'm Mexican?" She goes, "Because Spanish sounds so much nicer." To who? Not to me. And it shouldn't sound, quote, nicer to any of us. My granddaughter already knows she's Mexican, and she's half white and half Mexican, but her Mexican part is the one that's standing out, let me tell you. With a grandma like me, she's not gonna forget her ethnicity ever. And so she's always talking about how she speaks Spanish, and she'll correct everyone because she speaks a few words, but she's gonna be bilingual, that I can assure you. But again, we need to be proud of that ethnicity, and we need to carry it on. And we need to be proud of speaking Spanish. I remember growing up and my parents were always telling me, my dad, if we had to ask him for something, we had to ask him in Spanish. You know, when you're a kid, you go, oh, Dad. And now I'm so glad that he did that for us, because now we can speak Spanish and we can be bilingual. Maybe not as fluent as we'd like to be, but we're there and we can understand ourselves and be understood. But I would like to talk a little bit about the role of the women in the movement. I just want to digress for a second, now that I'm mentioning my dad, and tell you, one time I interviewed him and my mom, and my dad had an 8th grade education. My mom had a 2nd grade because her mother died when my mother was 9 years old. Her mom died, so she stayed at home. And yet they had a vision that went beyond survival. They didn't know what it meant, but they always kept saying, oh, you get as much education as you can, get as much education as you can. Remember when I was getting my PhD, I got my BA, and my dad said, oh, ya eres doctora, are you a doctor already? I said, no. Then I got my master's, and he goes, ya eres doctora? I said, no, not yet. And he goes, oye, ¿no crees que te estás chiflando con tantas cosas? And don't you think you're getting carried away with so many graduations and you're still not a doctor? And I said, oh, Dad, if it was so easy to get one, everybody would have one. And but in the end, when I finally did get it, when it was the graduation for the PhD, he, because I was from Sangre, a small town, they did an article on it, and he carried that till the day that he died. Because my dad had come from Texas to get a better life for his family here, and when he came first, he came by himself in a truck where they loaded cattle, where they had the slats with a tarp over it, with 30 men standing in that truck all the way from Texas to California, with a bathroom break of one time a day. If you all know where South Texas is, that's days to get from there to here or back. And that's the sacrifice that they made. And then a generation later, they offered me a dean's job in South Texas, where he had come from. I didn't take it because I was at Hopkins at the time. But that's the sacrifice that our parents have made. That's what we need to be proud of. That's what we need to share, not the stereotypes that people believe of us, but the work that our people do and that our parents have. I often think that if parents if they have the information, they'll want the best for their kids. It's when they don't have the information that they worry, about, oh, maybe, you're going to get hurt or whatever. So it's up to us to educate our community and to make certain that we go as far as we can. And if we've made it, that's not enough. We need to make sure that everyone in our community goes as far as they can and has the opportunities that they can. And so I think the women, when they say the women, if the woman is educated in the family, everyone gets educated. I think that's really important, because as Chicanos, we really have a long and proud history of being of women involved in our communities, not only in supportive roles, but in leadership roles as well. For example, many of the mechas and other student organizations in the universities and colleges are led by women, and they have been for a very long time. And even from the time of Doña Josefa Dominguez, that in the 1800s, when she was threatened with jail, she stated, and she was threatened in front of the soldiers, right? She says, do you know why I am arrested? Because I want to give you a country to honor and respect, to take off your slavery, to remove the whip that has tormented your back and your children's back. And when threatened with death, she said, it would be an honor to shed my blood and give my life before these young men to teach them how a woman can die in defense of her ideals. And I think that you had the Adelitas and so forth. So we talk about women in this country finally making inroads. I want Chicanas and Latinas to know we've had those inroads for a very long time. We're not the passive woman, we never have been. And we've really made a difference, not only back then, but also now. Everything that was done during the Chicano movement, whether it was in the field of education or labor or you name it, women were involved. And they were not only in supportive roles, but in leadership roles. They took charge of a lot of things. I remember one time when I first started, and I said I was sort of tapada and the thing began, I remember we had this meeting at one of the students' apartments, and the women were in the kitchen cooking while the guys were talking, philosophizing. And I remember we sat at the doorway and we said, they're not saying anything that we don't understand. We can participate. And so that night we elected me as the chair of the organization here and not the men. Because again, we just took those kinds of roles that we had, and that happened with young Chicanas everywhere across the country. Another thing too that I think is we've made tremendous progress, and one of the big issues when we first started teaching was the idea of, how much time do I have? I think I reached my time, right? Okay, then let me conclude. But I do want to conclude with a clip. Did we get the clip for the United Farmworkers movie? Is that set? Okay, I just want to make a few more comments on the women. And on the kinds of other progress that we've made too, is that there's a lot of writers now in our community. When I first started teaching, we had to print out handouts. And now, and we all fought for the first book that came out, Occupied America, by Rudy Acuña. We all wanted to use it in our class. It was the only book that was out there. And now there are literally, without exaggeration, thousands of books written by and about Chicanos in literature, in the arts, in politics, in history, you name it, they're there. So again, yes, do we have problems? Yes, we do. We have too many still in our jails and prisons. We still have too many that are not finishing school. We still have too many young women who are getting pregnant and not completing their education. So we still have those issues that we have to deal with. We still have low wages in many of our jobs. We still don't have enough childcare so women can rise to bigger roles in their jobs. So yes, are the problems there? Yes, they are, and we need to address them. But also let's celebrate the kinds of progress that we've made in so many areas in our community through the hard work of so many others. So when someone says somebody opened the door for you to go through it, that's very true in our community. Somebody opened the door for me, I opened the door for somebody else, they'll open the door for somebody else. And that's what each one here has done and can do for those that follow, because we have a lot more work to do. And then if I can ask the gentleman if the clip for the United Farmworkers, this is a film called Fighting for Our Lives. It's an hour and a half. It's a really great film that talks about the struggles of the United Farmworkers. There was just too hard to get a clip out of it because everything I think is important. So I do ask that at some time, ask for that film and try to view it, because I think it will really open your eyes to the bravery of our people despite really going against all odds, to be able to succeed and become, and it shows the arrests that I was talking about, and the kinds, and people were killed, and people were arrested, and people, were discriminated against, and the kind of nonviolence that Cesar Chavez espoused in the face of so much violence against him and the farm workers. So let me see if it's ready for us to conclude.
Grandes amores de muchos colores me gustan a mí, y por eso los grandes amores.
When the Teamsters couldn't scare us by their insults and their jaunts and their jeers, they resorted to violence.
Many workers that were trying to walk out on strike were prevented from walking out on strike by Teamsters with lead pipes, baseball bats, guns, knives, clubs, grape stakes, leather whips, and other dangerous instruments.
Hey, we don't need clubs. We don't need sticks. We don't need clubs, man. We just need people, that's all.
There was Teamster Mike Falco, 6'4", and weighing 300 pounds. While some of Falco's friends held Father John Bank pinned behind his back, Falco smashed his face in with his fist. A few weeks later, in Arvin, a whole group of Teamsters attacked our picket line. Falco was arrested for attacking a striker with an irrigation pipe. Juan Hernandez, who was 62, landed up in the hospital with a fractured skull.
They surrounded our truck, and they told us to get off of our car, and we refused to get off of our car, and so they pulled us out.
And hit him and...
More and more Teamsters began to attack the strikers on the way to the picket line.
And hit the other guy.
One member of this family refused to appear on camera because he'd been hit in the mouth with a baseball bat.
It's not difference of opinion, Sheriff. They're coming, it's a paid damn plan to come and beat the hell out of us. It's not difference of opinion. What there is that the growers and the teamsters have made up their mind they're going to stop this strike at all costs.
I was taking 3 people to the doctor, to the clinic in Coachella. We were run off the road by one of the head teamsters named Miranda.
We've had some of our leaders beaten up today right in front of the police. You had 2, there were a whole group of goons there. You had 2 officers. By the time they come to the picket lines, our people are already beaten. They're now roving in like a bunch of animals, you know, after our people.
And as I rounded Highway 195 under Hayes, 2 cars overcame me and pushed me off the road. And 7 guys jumped out, all Teamster goons, flung open my doors, and they started swinging.
This man came at us with a knife. He got a big stick, you know, bigger than my neck, and hit me across the head 3 times.
You know what they're gone to? They don't care whether they're strikers, and as long as they're Mexicans, they're stopping him and beating him up in the streets.
17 stitches in the head.
Early one morning in June, Francisco Campos, his wife, and his 3-year-old daughter were asleep in their house trailer. Their house was set on fire by a group of men, and it was only the quick action of a neighbor that saved their lives.
I was asleep. My sister called me, you know, and as soon as I walked out the door, I saw the fire, you know. I came and knocked on the window.
On June 21st, 1973, approximately 5:20 in the morning, there was a farm worker who was picking up some of his workers. He had been followed to this location by, as we found out later, 2 Teamster members. The suspects followed him to this location, blocked his entrance to the camp, forced him out of the car, beat him up, and threatened him with an ice pick. And they stuck him several times with the ice pick, holding it against his throat and threatening his life. Both suspects were placed under arrest for kidnapping and assault with intent to commit murder.
Chavez, no! Chavez, no! Chavez, no!
We weren't going to be stopped. So in spite of the violent campaign of the Teamsters and the growers, our strike grew as the harvest moved north into the San Joaquin Valley.
Before you is very clear. We want you to take out everybody in those fields. Wherever possible, let's make sure that the grapes turn into raisins on the vines. Let's make sure that in the boycott, if the growers sell the grapes, make sure that the grapes are sold for less money than what it costs them to pick them. It's very important that we work day and night. We have to put maximum input. We've got to put an awful lot of work into winning this election. We can win very soon. Thank you.
La
place to end this because, again, it shows the unity that occurred. And now the UFW is led by Teresa Romero, a woman, and she's doing a great job too. So as we said, the struggle continues, but there's always good people doing the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Lea. Yeah, definitely the struggle continues, and I think that we need to go back to that kind of activism, you know, because sometimes I think that we have changed in going more in advocating in the policy, which is good, but there are times that we need to be on the street again. So it is a real treat having you here today, and what a better way of closing the Activist Fellowship Program by inviting you to share what you know, your own experience, what you have witnessed, and the struggles that you've been part of it. And for the young people to know that we have, what we have said before, that even though there are things that we still need to do, there has been people that has been opening many, many doors. And now that's what I tell young people, my kids and everybody, now is your turn. Yeah. Now is your turn. So there is people like Lea, Cesar Chavez, and many others, Dolores Huerta, and many others that have really, and they put their lives on risk, you know, and that, but they have really fought for justice. And so I want to thank you, Lea, and I have the honor of meeting Lea for almost 30-something years, right? So she was one of the first person that I met here, and I have been following your work and your service, so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Thank you.
And we have a few minutes for questions or comments, if any of you would like to add something that you know, or you would like to ask a question for Lea.
Yeah, I think that one good thing about this new generation is that they really are active in different things. I mean, you saw, I think, the big resurgence with Black Lives Matter, where you have a new generation that's out there and is really active and so forth. And I see it in the college campuses. And so I think it's a matter of again, going back and reminding them that if they're here, it's because somebody opened those doors for them, as I said before, and that they owe it to those that come after them to open even more doors. And so I think that they need to be passionate about, I was usually passionate about a topic, whether it's you know, the farm workers and helping them, whether it's police, whether it's education in the universities, whatever it is that they're passionate about, because there's so many issues that they need to deal with. And I would suggest that that's what happened. And then the people that know the struggles, to let them know what has happened before and why continuing to participate is important. Otherwise, we'll have a generation that just, you know, thinks about, well, what am I going to wear today, or, you know, what movie am I going to go see, or who am I going to go out with, and not realize, yes, we need to think about all those things because that's part of life, but also focus on something that's really going to help someone, whether it's poverty, whether it's a famine, whether it's, I mean, look at how much conflict we have in the world today. Look at what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in so many countries, what's happening in our own country, where we have some children that are going to bed hungry. So look at those kinds of issues and pick an issue that's really important that you can make a difference in. And I've always said, to be a leader doesn't mean you have to lead thousands. I mean, we've been fortunate to have leaders like Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, that can get thousands of people to follow them. But it can be being a parent that educates your child about certain things. It can be a teacher that directs their children, you know, in the classroom to be more just and to be more, you know, fair and not to bully each other. There's all, you know, everyone can be a leader in their own way. It can be a person that talks to their friends, because it always takes courage. I always tell my students, it takes courage, more courage to speak up than to stay silent. How many times have people stayed silent? I remember this student when I was at Hopkins teaching there that she says, you know, Dr. Ybarra, she goes, I always remember when you said about that once you're aware, you can never be unaware. And Maya Angelou said that, once you're aware, you can never be unaware. And she says that she was on a bus because over there, California is so large here, but over there, Maryland and New York are like 2 hours apart, right? She was on a bus going to New York, and she said there was this person in the back that just kept making all these awful remarks, racist remarks, and she goes, and she didn't want to say anything. She was afraid to say something, but she goes and she finally said, in the back of my neck, she goes, I could hear you saying, and she goes, oh no, what would Dr. Ybarra say if she saw me here and knew that I wasn't saying anything? She goes, she spoke up. She says, she turned around and she said, I would appreciate it if you didn't say that. And she says, everybody in the bus applauded. So it was because none of them liked what this person was saying, but nobody had the courage to speak up. So it takes courage. It takes courage for a white person to go against their friends and say, you know what, I don't really like that joke, or that's not appropriate. It takes courage for a minority person to also step up and not want to laugh at, and not laugh at racist jokes because he didn't want to set himself apart, and to say, you know what, that's not right. So it takes courage to speak up. And I think if we can do that, whether it's with a few friends, whether it's in our home, whether it's with, a classroom, a large group of people, wherever you are, you can make a difference. And I think that's what young people, or all of us, need to keep in mind, that we can all make a difference. Even stopping somebody from saying one racist joke. Because I can guarantee you, if that person's telling me a joke about blacks, he'll turn around and tell somebody else a joke about Mexicans, because it's the same mentality. So when we defend ourselves and when we defend others, that's when I think that the courage sets in and makes us realize what we can do as human beings.
Go ahead.
I think things are happening. I think they don't happen at the speed that we want. We're still fighting issues that we should have fought. It's like I said, every generation has new issues, but they also have old issues that resurface. So it does get frustrating, no doubt about it. Because why are we still fighting this when we fought it, 20, 30 years ago? And here it's happening again. But I really do think that when I see the young people today, I think they're more aware. I think they're less judgmental. Not everybody, again, depends on who you're raised with, right? But I do see that awareness, and I go back again to the Black Lives Matter movement, that you saw so many different ethnicities in there that were supporting the Black lives because they realized that was important to support. And so I think that in the farm workers movement is the same thing. You see a lot of the support that Chavez and the farm workers have had, and now Teresa Romero has, is from non-Mexicanos, because people see when there's an injustice and they move forward to it. So I would just say keep the faith and know that there are, not enough, obviously, but that there are people out there trying to make a difference. When you look at the charities and the people that gather food for victims and so forth, I think it's heartening to know that, and so we have to sort of keep that above the disheartening part of people not doing enough, because there are people out there that are doing things, I think, in university campuses and in our communities.
Well, I think that we could stay here one more hour. But I would like to give opportunity to others if you have an urgent question to ask.
The work that has been done in the past and still sharing. Watching the videos from the United Farmworkers is that my dad was actually one of them out of Orosi, which he was a contratista. So he had a lot of heart in what he did. Still attending the meetings, we worked in the fields, but yeah, we had to go home and change real quick to make it to the meeting. And we'd be there all night long. And then they would do the walk to Sacramento. And growing up, my dad always told me that I wouldn't understand how valuable life would be if I finished school. And I told him, I don't see a lot of people graduating from school, you know, I'm going to probably work in the field. But until I got a teenager from being in the field when they were already mandating that children shouldn't be in the field, I was still in the field up until a certain point. And then after that, maybe 2 years of babysitting, but then I became of age to get right back in the fields. We never left the fields. So I grew up with that, you know, seeing my dad as a role model, even though he didn't finish 6th grade. You know, his dad passed away when he was 14 years old, so he had to leave Jalisco, Mexico, to come over here at the age of 14 to take care of the 6 siblings that weren't making it and send money back. Then my mom, she's full-blood Native. I grew up attending her meeting with AIM, American Indian Movement. So even though I was born in the 70s, I've seen that part. So when I started having my children, I told them, I don't care how long it takes. You need to finish school. I finished high school, but what my mom would tell me is almost, and she meant it in as knowledgeable, like meaning I'm going to show you the culture, but you need to go the rest of the way and get your education. She said a dangerous, she would tell us like, a dangerous Indian is knowing their culture. The most dangerous one is the educated one because they're the ones that are going to help the ones behind them and help the elders that are in front of them to not forget where we came from. So I had both upbringing.
That's good. That was a rich upbringing that you had.
So when I do that, I think of them. My mother's passed already, and I'm proud of all my daughters because they all, you know, I told them, I never gave you guys a deadline. I'd say finish school and turn around and help those people behind us. And don't forget the ones that are in front of us. Because, again, in our tribe anymore, half the tribe was wiped out when they were pushed. And then the rest of half of the tribe left when they got pushed to the hills and back. And I always tell them, whoever our relative was to make that journey all the way out there and make it all the way back when they lost half the tribe, I said, that meant we have a purpose over here. And so I just want to commend you for that. And I remember my brother always bringing me to Fresno, attending different kinds of Chicano movements. And my brother's full Native, but he felt like it was important for me to see. He was a student at Fresno City College, and he said, this is what we're supposed to do. This is what Mom needs. And I always remember that, you know, like, so I commend you for still sharing that, because it took me back, and I thought of all the things that we had to go through, but also I remember the hard times in the fields, how we were treated. There was no bathrooms. There was, you know, it was long days, long nights. I just always remember that. Even though it was hard, I had good memories.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Even though it's hard work, the memories are so good because of the fact that the family was together and you know, you overcame and you saw your parents' hard work. So thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important. And I think that there is a lot of connection between Native Americans and Mexicanos because we're indigenous too. I mean, it's Mayas and Aztecs and instead of Apache and Navajo, but you know, there was so much intermixture anyway that I think but I'm glad that that you lived a really rich cultural history and that you're passing that on to your children. That's really important. I think, I always tell people, they said, you know, you guys should assimilate and all this. I said, you know, we've been here for hundreds of years. I'm still speaking Spanish. You know, people, my grandchildren, my daughter and now my granddaughters are in ballet folklorico. In fact, when I go to Mexico, they say, you guys are more Mexican than we are. You have all this ballet folklorico and you have all this tortillas and everything else. They say, we're already eating pan and you guys just with your tortillas. And everywhere they go, they see the ballet folklorico and the mariachi bands and all of that. But I think we have to retain that. And I always tell, and I told my kids and I'm telling my grandchildren, when you can think of other cultures, I mean, yes, we're Americans, and we're proud of that, and we can enjoy that part of it. But we also are so much richer when we also can do our Mexican culture and be proud of that. And so you were very lucky to have those two cultures that you were able to grow up with.
Okay, I think that we will have to have a second round of this conversation. I think we need more of these stories. And we could stay for longer, but we will have to wrap up here. And I think we will do this off camera. Lea has a treat for the fellows and the activist staff team for all the effort. I know that it was very challenging for everybody during COVID doing these programs that imply so much community engagement, and we were very we have many restrictions for that, for bringing people together. So I want to really commend the fellows and the activist team, Estela, Minerva, and the volunteers, and Gina, Dr. Gina, which is not here. As I said, it was a very challenging process, but we did it.
That's right.
We did it. We are here, we close it. And what a better way of closing it with this conversation. So thank you.
I just want to add that I did this with Edward James Olmos. And so I had the book, send them to him, and he signed the books for all the fellows and stuff, and the staff. So anyway, and he was happy to do it because he loves the program and when I told him about it. And this is sort of the culmination. We talk about the Chicano movement because it shows Mexicanos and Latinos in all kinds of roles, from the ones that are doing the shells of the oysters to the ones that are the astronauts. And it shows the whole spectrum of us. And there's even a photograph of a Mexicano crossing the river and with his wife. And they say, why did you show that? I said, because that's us too. We can't be ashamed of anybody. Every job has dignity. And for me, the minute they cross into the border, they're Americanos. You know, and it's our responsibility to help with each other. So I'm as proud of the astronauts as I am of those Mexicanos crossing that river to try to get a better life for their family. Mm-hmm. And so again, hopefully you'll enjoy the book that we did.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And thank you to the technicians
yes,
for getting those clips
for
on.
sure.
I
Let me
appreciate
bring
that.
the books, no?
Yeah.
Yeah.